It's Queen Mary University of London. And I suppose that is the big question. Why aren't we seeing any of Sir Keir Starmer?
I think the Starmer leadership has been defined by a kind of caution, which is quite interesting because when you think back to the leadership election in 2020, Starmer presented himself as continuity Corbyn, that he was really just going to be carrying on the policies of Corbyn, the radical policies of Corbyn, but with a better way of presenting them. And of course, really almost as soon as he got those votes from the Labour members to become leader, he's really abandoned that outlook. In many ways, concern one might have about the Starmer leadership is that he's operating under a kind of orthodoxy about political strategy that was accurate for the context of the 1990s, when Labour was indeed 20 points ahead in the polls. Tony Blair inherited a Labour Party from John Smith that had a double-digit poll lead. And the economic conditions in the 1990s were very different as well. This was a time of growing prosperity, certainly as the decade wore on. One thing that I note is that when Blair was elected, it was only 15 years since the winter of discontent, which is about the same time as between now and the financial crisis. So I think Starmer is being advised by people who perhaps think, well, the way that Labour wins is by repeating the kind of caution that defined the Blair leadership in the lead up to 1997. But I'm afraid that the political and economic context for today is so different that I don't think that's a winning strategy.
Easy to be cautious when you're already very far ahead in the polls, but if you're trying to get to that lead in the first place, you might need to make a bit more of a splash. I wonder, though, in what direction should that splash be made? Gordon Brown, of course, calling for temporary nationalisation this week. But the Labour Party seems to be steering away from that. Indeed, the strategy of the Labour Party has been to veer away from the dangers that might bring electorally, promising things that couldn't be funded or indeed that people remember of less than fondly. What else could the Labour Party be doing? Or would it be simply enough for them to say something, whatever it is?
Part of the problem is that the Labour Party hasn't really looked at why it lost recent elections. There's a group in the Labour Party that think that Labour lost the 2019 election because it had a radical manifesto. There's a group that say that actually the kind of economic policies weren't to blame. It was Labour's approach on Brexit and support for a second referendum. Personally, I think there's more evidence that it's the latter than the former. Indeed, the 2017 manifesto, although Labour, of course, still lost that election, it saw the biggest swing to Labour in one election. 10 points. Labour's lead went up 10 points between 2015 and 2017. So part of it is a problem where I think there's the people around Starmer want to say that actually the reason that Labour lost was because of the economic programme of the Corbyn years. But it might well be that actually it was the very Brexit policy that Keir Starmer himself had piloted as shadow Brexit secretary in those years, which is something a bit uncomfortable and awkward for Labour people to admit. And I think this goes to the heart of the problem of the Starmer leadership, is that there is a breach of trust. There's been two breaches of trust, I think, with Starmer leadership. One is with Leave voters, where Labour went into 2017 saying it would respect the referendum, and then Starmer used his period as shadow Brexit secretary to do everything to jettison that pledge. And then there's been another breach of trust with Labour members, where Starmer pledged to be continuity Corbyn on policy, and he hasn't been. And, for a person who has made the whole case for his leadership that he's someone who can be trusted, in contrast to Boris Johnson, the Conservative parties, this seems like a slightly odd strategy to be taking.
Interesting, the Labour Party trying to set itself up as this trust versus no trust question, really basing its entire strategy on the fact that it was going to be battling Boris Johnson. I wonder if that becomes a much bigger problem for Labour now, talking about this question of trust. when they're up against someone like Liz Truss, were she to become the Conservative Party Prime Minister. Her whole brand, her whole leadership election has been built on this question of trust and following through with promises and reversing the national insurance rise that was promised to not go ahead. I wonder if there's that question of authenticity and trust in a dichotomy between Truss and Starmer, does Starmer start to fare worse?
The fundamentals of Starmer's leadership ratings are pretty poor. And this is partly because people don't feel they fully know him, but I think also because for many voters, he's known for those two things that I just mentioned. One is his support for a second referendum, and the other is saying that he would carry on the Corbyn manifesto and then abandoning it. If Truss can present herself as an authentic politician, someone who's principled and does what she believes, then that could be, I think, very damaging to Starmer. I have to say that I don't think her record during this leadership election has been very strong on that front, where there's been policy announcements and then they've been retracted and so on. I think she needs to step away from that. I think she really needs to think about what she believes and stick with it. We're in a period of time where people are very cynical about politicians and politics. Again, a difference from the 90s, even though there was sleaze in the 90s. The trust that people have in their political institutions is much lower now than it once was. And people are looking for politicians who are authentic. This is why outsider politicians have been doing so well in the past decade. I don't know if Truss can present herself as an outsider politician. It'd be interesting. Yeah. She might have some room to do so. Yeah. Starmer has made that choice not to do so.
Well, that's a big opportunity, or indeed challenge, for whoever becomes the next leader of the Tory party. Well, for now, Richard Johnson, lecturer in politics at the Queen Mary University of London, thank you so much for talking through that really important issue. Finally today, to the mid-20th century, where from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the